One prediction by the astrologer speaks of a great man struck by a thunderbolt, and his supporters interpret this as an assassination attempt or a sudden collapse of political power.
In 2026, American warships are operating around Iranian ports, attacks on shipping have returned to the Strait of Hormuz, Russia and Ukraine are striking deeper into each other's territory, and Taiwan is openly practicing what it would do during a blockade or attack. Almost 500 years ago, Nostradamus wrote, "7 months great war, people dead through evil. That alone would be unsettling." But that is not the prediction people are worried about anymore, because when readers went deeper into his old quatrains, they found other warnings now being connected with the same period: a sudden attack, severe bloodshed, the fall of someone powerful, a strange symbol connected with a shift in power, and finally, something that sounds almost hopeful: renewal. At first, they look like separate predictions, but place them in the order people are reading them now, and something much worse appears. Not one disaster, a sequence. And if that interpretation is right, the most frightening prediction about 2026 may not be what happens this year. It may be what this year starts. The first warning already feels too close. The old war passage had been sitting inside Nostradamus' writing for centuries. What changed was the world around it. The conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran has already shown how quickly fighting in one region can reach people thousands of miles away. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy routes. When traffic through it collapsed during the conflict, the consequences did not stay near Iran. Oil flows changed. Commercial shipping became more dangerous. Governments far from the battlefield suddenly had to think about energy security, and that is only one front. In Ukraine, the war is still producing attacks far beyond the original front lines. On August 10th, a Russian strike on a steel plant in Zaporizhzhia killed 7 people. Ukrainian officials said North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles had been used. Ukraine has also continued sending long-range drones deep inside Russia and hitting oil infrastructure hundreds of miles from the battlefield. Then look east. From August 5th through 14th, Taiwan has been carrying out its Han Kuang military exercises. The drills are not just soldiers running through ordinary training. They include naval operations, reservists, emergency communications, and preparations for what civilian life could look like if China attempted a blockade or attack. Even mobile internet speeds have been deliberately reduced in some exercises so people can experience what communications pressure might feel like during a real crisis. That is why the old war warning is being read differently now. Nostradamus did not name Iran. He did not write Ukraine. He never mentioned Taiwan. He could not have imagined ballistic missiles, drones, or aircraft carriers. But the central fear inside the old passage, a major conflict lasting for months, is no longer difficult to picture. And that is only the first prediction, because another passage suggests the war may not begin the way people expect. The next warning is about how it starts. Nostradamus was born in France in 1503. He lived in a world of plague, primitive medicine, astrology, and handwritten charts. Yet the writings that made him famous were deliberately difficult. In 1555, he published Les Prophéties, a collection built largely from short 4-line verses known as quatrains. He mixed languages, changed spellings, played with names, used animals and symbols instead of direct descriptions. A ruler might appear as a lion. A location could be hidden behind an altered name. A disaster might appear without a year beside it. That style is one reason people have argued about Nostradamus for centuries. A clean prediction can fail and be forgotten. A cryptic one can wait. Then history moves, something happens, and suddenly people return to the old verse and see details they did not notice before. That pattern is important because the war warning is not the only passage now being discussed around 2026. Another has been interpreted as describing a secret or nighttime attack. That changes the picture. A prolonged war is frightening enough, but an unexpected strike gives it a possible beginning. Something happens quickly, the target responds, allies start asking what they are required to do. Military bases go on alert, shipping routes change, airspace closes, markets react before anyone fully understands what happened. A surprise attack in the 16th century could shock a kingdom. A surprise attack today can move through military alliances, energy markets, and communication systems within hours. And that is where Nostradamus' reputation becomes important, because this would not be the first time one of his strange passages seemed much clearer after a real event occurred. The incident that made people remember his name involved a king, a tournament, and a shattered lance. The death that made Nostradamus famous. Years before it happened, Nostradamus wrote about a young lion overcoming an older one in combat. The verse described a golden cage being pierced, then wounds, then a cruel death. At the time, those words could have meant almost anything. Then came 1559. King Henry II of France entered a tournament in Paris. His opponent was Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of the King's Scottish Guard. The two men charged toward each other with wooden lances while wearing heavy armor and helmets. Then Montgomery's lance shattered. A splinter passed through an opening in Henry's helmet and struck him near the eye. The king was carried away. Doctors tried for days to save him. They failed. Henry II died. Only afterward did people return to the old quatrain. A younger lion, an older lion, combat, a cage being pierced, a terrible wound. Suddenly the words looked different. That event became one of the most famous stories attached to Nostradamus, and it changed how people treated everything else he had written. A strange verse no longer had to make sense immediately. Readers could leave it alone for decades and wonder whether some future event would eventually explain it. Nostradamus died in 1566. His book did not, and almost exactly 1 century after the year of his death, another disaster pushed people back into those same pages. This time, there was no king. There was an entire city, and one number made the connection difficult to forget. Then, London burned. In September 1666, fire swept through London. The Great Fire of London burned for days and destroyed thousands of buildings. Large parts of the city were left in ruins. Then readers returned to Nostradamus. One of his passages became famous because people connected its language with London fire and the number 66. Nostradamus had died in 1566. London burned in 1666. For people already fascinated by the Henry II story, that was enough to keep searching, and this became the pattern surrounding his reputation. History moved first, then somebody reopened the book. The famous predictions became interesting, but the unfinished ones became even more disturbing, because if an old passage could suddenly look different after a king died or a city burned, what about the verses people still could not explain? That question survived for centuries, and it is the same reason readers keep returning to Nostradamus now. But there is an important difference in 2026. The old verses are not being compared with one historical event that has already ended. They are being placed beside crises that are still moving. Iran, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, Taiwan. No one knows where those stories end yet. And when the war warning is placed beside the second passage, the one involving an unexpected attack, the modern interpretation begins to form a sequence. But the third warning takes that sequence somewhere much darker, because after the attack comes blood. The third prediction is where it gets worse. The present conflict around Iran offers a disturbing example of how quickly separate risks can connect. The first U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran began on February 28th. Iran disrupted passage through the Strait of Hormuz. A ceasefire was eventually reached in June. It did not last. By July, the United States had again imposed a blockade on Iranian shipping. By August, attacks on commercial vessels were again part of the crisis. Then Iran warned Gulf states that another American attack could bring retaliation against critical energy infrastructure across the region. Think about how quickly that expands the map. A strike aimed at Iran could create danger around a refinery or port in another Gulf country. That could affect shipping. Shipping disruption could affect energy prices. American forces could respond again. Countries that did not begin the conflict could find themselves pulled into it because their bases, territory, or energy infrastructure suddenly matter. Now add the next Nostradamus image being linked with the modern prediction cycle: bloodshed, not political tension, not warnings, actual violence. Another passage has been interpreted as describing a sudden fall or death involving someone powerful. Nostradamus gives no modern name, and forcing one onto the verse would make the story weaker. The disturbing part is the order: a prolonged conflict, a sudden attack, then heavier bloodshed, then someone important disappears. During a calm year, the death of a political leader can usually be absorbed through normal systems. During a major international crisis, it can change negotiations, military decisions, and alliances almost overnight. And in 2026, governments are already preparing for exactly the kind of confusion that can follow an unexpected incident. On NATO's eastern edge, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have increased security around power facilities, dams, and other critical infrastructure. One unidentified drone or staged attack could immediately create a dangerous question. Who did it? Because if the answer involves an attack on a NATO member, the consequences stop being local. And once leadership itself becomes unstable, Nostradamus' next symbol begins to look much more important: a swarm. The strangest prediction may be about who rises next. The image is strange. Bees, a swarm. Readers have interpreted it in several ways over the years. An army, a political movement. Followers gathering around a ruler, a force that looks small at first but becomes powerful because more and more people join it. There is no single interpretation everyone agrees on, but the symbol becomes more interesting when placed beside another theme associated with the modern reading: a change in the balance of power. Look at what Taiwan is already preparing for. During the Hongkwang exercises, Taiwan practiced joint Navy and Coast Guard operations designed to counter a blockade. Ships rehearsed protecting commercial traffic and dealing with sea mines. Civil defense exercises tested what would happen if communications were disrupted. And on August 13th, Taiwan's defense ministry said 18 Chinese military aircraft and 11 naval vessels had been operating around the island during the previous 24 hours. Those drills do not mean a war is guaranteed. They show what governments believe they need to be ready for. And a major conflict around Taiwan would not only be about Taiwan. The island sits at the center of global trade and the technology supply chain. China is central to the region. The United States is deeply tied to the security balance. A major confrontation would immediately create bigger questions. Who controls the surrounding seas? Which allies enter? What happens to global trade? And most importantly, who becomes stronger when the crisis ends? That is where the swarm becomes more disturbing. Maybe the symbol is not describing the destruction itself. Maybe it is describing what begins gathering after the old order weakens. Because Nostradamus' next theme is not another battlefield. It is something that sounds almost positive. And that may be the most dangerous prediction of all. Then the prophecy suddenly changes direction. After war, attack, bloodshed, and changing power, some modern interpretations point toward a very different idea: renewal. At first, that sounds like relief, but renewal only becomes necessary when something has changed enough that the old version cannot simply continue. And 2026 already gives that idea an uncomfortable backdrop. Governments are not dealing with military crises alone. Western Europe has faced extreme heat this year. Britain called an emergency meeting during its fifth heat wave of 2026 after experiencing its driest July in 190 years. Around 45 million people were living in drought-affected areas. Fire services had already responded to hundreds of wildfires. Along Croatia's Dalmatian coast, a wildfire driven by dry conditions and strong winds forced hundreds of people from their homes. Authorities even positioned a naval vessel in case evacuation by sea became necessary. None of those events proves anything about Nostradamus but place environmental pressure beside military pressure, and the problem changes. War can raise energy costs while heat strains electricity systems. Drought can pressure water and food supplies, while governments are increasing defense spending. Shipping disruption can raise prices at the same time civilians are being told to prepare for emergencies. Countries rarely get to choose one crisis at a time. That is where renewal stops sounding simple. If enough pressure builds, governments change, alliances change, trade routes change, political movements grow, old arrangements weaken, something new eventually occupies the space, and suddenly, the 2026 interpretation looks very different. Maybe the predictions are not describing several unrelated disasters. Maybe they are describing stages of a transition. If that is true, then 2026 does not need to contain the entire prophecy. It only needs to contain the first domino. And Nostradamus left one final clue that makes that possibility much harder to dismiss: a date, 3797. The date that makes 2026 even more terrifying. Nostradamus did not write the number 2026 beside these quatrains. That needs to be understood. The modern connection comes from interpreters taking different passages and placing them beside events unfolding now. But Nostradamus did write on a prophetic scale far larger than 1 year. In the preface to Les Prophéties, his prophetic horizon has traditionally been associated with the distant year 3797. Think about how far away that is. Not another decade, not another century. A future so distant that our entire world would be ancient history. And that creates a problem for the simplest interpretation of his 2026 predictions. If his vision continues that far into the future, then 2026 cannot be the final ending. There is too much time left, which means the darker possibility is not everything ends in 2026. It is something starts in 2026. Now, the earlier warnings take on another meaning. A prolonged war could weaken governments. An unexpected attack could widen that war. Bloodshed could accelerate political pressure. The loss of an important figure could change leadership. A new political force or alliance could gather strength. Then comes renewal, not because everything returned to normal, because enough had changed that a new normal had to be built. That is why the modern interpretation is worse than one frightening prophecy. One disaster can end. A sequence creates consequences, and those consequences can outlive the event that started them. But if 2026 really is only the opening stage, there is one final question left. How much of that sequence is already visible? Now, look at what is already happening. In August 2026, people do not need to imagine a world under pressure. They can already see one. A real conflict is disrupting one of the world's most important energy corridors. Russia and Ukraine are striking deeper into each other's territory. NATO countries bordering Russia are increasing security around critical infrastructure. Taiwan is rehearsing what happens if its ports, communications, and sea routes come under pressure. Chinese military aircraft and ships continue operating around the island. Europe is dealing with heat, drought, and wildfires at the same time governments are managing military and economic uncertainty. Again, none of those events individually proves Nostradamus predicted 2026. The disturbing part is what happens when they stop being viewed individually. One conflict affects shipping. Shipping affects energy. Energy affects economies. Military pressure changes budgets. Political instability changes governments. A leadership shock changes alliances. Another power sees an opening. What looked like several separate crises can become one period of transformation. That is exactly why the 2026 predictions have become more disturbing as the year has unfolded. People originally focused on the war warning, but the deeper they went, the less the story looked like one prediction about one conflict. The attack passage suggested a trigger. The bloodshed suggested escalation. The fallen figure suggested political shock. It may already be starting. Nostradamus died in 1566. His writings survived him by nearly 5 centuries. People returned to them after Henry II died. They returned after London burned. They returned during later wars, political crises, and disasters. And now the book is open again. But this time, the world is not looking backward at one finished event. The events are still unfolding. Iran, Hormuz, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, Taiwan, China, record heat, drought, wildfires. At first, people reopened Nostradamus because of the old warning about a prolonged war. Then they found something worse, a sudden attack. then bloodshed, then a powerful figure falling, then the strange image of a force gathering, then a change in global power, then renewal, and finally, a prophetic horizon reaching toward 3797. Put together, the interpretation no longer looks like a prediction of one terrible moment. It looks like a chain reaction. One event creates pressure. Pressure creates another event. Governments change. Alliances move. Power shifts. Then the world that comes after the crisis is different from the one that entered it. That is the part people often miss when they hear the word prophecy. They expect one dramatic moment, one date, one explosion. History rarely works that way. The event everyone remembers is often only the beginning. A war ends, but the borders it changed remain. A leader dies, but the government that replaces him can last for decades. A shipping crisis ends, but companies may already have found another route. A military threat disappears, but defense budgets, alliances, and public fear do not automatically return to where they were before. That is how 1 year can matter long after the calendar changes, and that is what makes the modern Nostradamus interpretation so difficult to shake. Maybe the 7-month war warning is not the worst part. Maybe the surprise attack is not the worst part. Maybe even bloodshed and political collapse are not the final warning, because those events eventually stop. The more disturbing possibility is what they leave behind: a different balance of power, a different political order, different alliances, different borders, a world reorganized by events that began while everyone was still asking whether the crisis would blow over. And with Nostradamus's prophetic horizon stretching centuries beyond us, perhaps that was always the point. 2026 was never supposed to contain the whole prediction. It only had to contain the beginning. So when people ask whether Nostradamus's 2026 predictions are coming true, the most unsettling answer may not be found in one verse or one headline. It may be found in the direction everything is moving, because the truly frightening prediction was never simply that something terrible would happen in 2026. It was that once it started, the world afterward might never return to what it was before. And if that is what Nostradamus was warning about, then the worst part is not that his predictions are beginning to look familiar. It is that we may still be watching the first part come true. So what do you think? Are people seeing patterns that are not really there, or have the events of 2026 made the old Nostradamus warnings harder to ignore? Tell me which prediction concerns you most. And if you enjoy mysteries like this, subscribe, because the next warning may be even stranger.